History documents many monarchs who commanded massive armies and vast resources. Yet the absolute rulers of the ancient world lived in deep fear of a young man who carried no weapons and held no formal rank. In the early 6th century BC, the Babylonian military breached the walls of Jerusalem. Following the victory, imperial officials systematically selected the city's most capable young men to be transported hundreds of miles away to the capital. This forced relocation was the first step in a calculated psychological takeover. The empire worked to dismantle the captives' native language and customs, replacing them with Babylonian education and theology. This strategy aimed to erase any moral or spiritual authority that existed independently of the state. Total imperial control depends on the monarch becoming the subject's only source of meaning. The bureaucracy moved quickly to overwrite Daniel's identity. Officials stripped him of his Hebrew name and issued him a daily ration of rich food and wine from the king's personal table. Accepting this food carried heavy political weight. In the ancient Near East, eating the king's provisions served as a silent oath of dependence, forcing the captive to acknowledge the monarch as the sole provider of life. Daniel recognized the trap, but avoided a loud public rebellion. Instead, he proposed a quiet 10-day experiment. He and his friends would eat only vegetables and water, followed by a direct health comparison with the other captives. When the 10 days ended, the physical evidence was clear. Daniel and his companions appeared more vital than the youths eating from the king's table, proving that the royal diet was unnecessary for their well-being. By drawing a strict boundary around his personal diet, Daniel established a crucial precedent. The capacity to withstand immense political tyranny is built through these small, private decisions to remain consistent. At its height, Babylon projected staggering material wealth. King Nebuchadnezzar ruled from a fortress of massive defensive walls and vibrant monuments, exercising absolute control over millions of subjects. Yet that outward dominance masked a deep psychological fragility. The king began waking up terrified by nightmares he couldn't remember. In his paranoia, he threatened to execute his entire council of advisors unless they could describe both the dream and its meaning. While the court elite panicked, Daniel requested a brief delay to pray. By morning, he possessed a clear understanding of the king's vision. This diagram illustrates the structure of the king's vision. He saw a massive statue divided into tiers of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, representing a sequence of earthly empires. Then, a single rock, cut without human hands, struck the statue at its base. Daniel delivered a blunt interpretation. The gold head represented Babylon, but its glory was temporary. This empire and every superpower that followed would be crushed and replaced by a sovereign authority that would fill the earth. This revelation shattered the king's sense of permanence. It proved that spiritual insight perceives the end of worldly power, even when that power is at its peak. The king's humility quickly faded. Driven by a rebounding ego, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the construction of a towering gold statue and mandated that every citizen bow in worship or face a blazing furnace. Daniel's companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to kneel. They informed the king that their God could save them, but their refusal stood regardless of the outcome. Infuriated by this defiance, the king responded by ordering the furnace to be heated 7 times beyond its normal limit. The men were bound and thrown into the fire, but when the king looked in, he saw 4 figures walking freely. The men emerged from the furnace unscathed, with no scent of smoke on their clothing. The king's most lethal deterrent had proven ineffective. Years later, when Nebuchadnezzar was boasting of the city he had built, his mind fractured. He was driven away from human society to live like a wild beast in the fields, his hair growing matted and his nails like claws. A ruler who views themselves as a god inevitably degrades. Without a higher moral grounding, power turns the human mind into something destructive and instinct-driven. Decades passed, Babylon fell, and the Medo-Persian Empire took control. The flags and the monarchs changed, but the political paranoia within the royal courts remained constant. Jealous officials within the new administration manipulated King Darius into signing an unalterable law. It made prayer to anyone but the king a capital offense, specifically targeting Daniel's known habits. The king paced his halls, realizing he had legally trapped his most trusted advisor. Daniel, now an elderly statesman, simply went to his open window and knelt in prayer, maintaining the same rhythm he had followed for decades. Daniel's arrest forced his descent into a den of starved lions. When the king rushed to the pit the next morning, he found the prophet alive. A divine intervention had shut the mouths of the beasts, defeating both their natural instinct and the king's decree. Daniel's composure was the product of a lifetime of steady devotion. This consistent spiritual discipline provided the necessary defense when political traps finally closed around him. Daniel's survival was followed by unsettling prophetic visions. He saw future geopolitical eras depicted as horrific beasts violently emerging from a dark sea. These visions carried a hopeful message. While oppressive, heavily armed regimes rise to suppress the truth, an eternal court will eventually sit in judgment to unseat them. The absolute monarchs Daniel served seemed invincible in their time. Today, their names are footnotes, and their fortresses have crumbled into dust. Political borders shift, and worldly tyrants fall. Yet a soul anchored in truth and quiet faith possesses the only power that remains constant.